again. In our last lesson, we were talking about faith in its objective sense, meaning the faith not just simply by which I believe, but the faith which I profess, which is given to me through the church. Remember we said last time, we got a great quote by St. Cyprian, that one cannot have God as his father who does not have the church as his mother. Now, the objective content of faith, which is found in the totality of divine revelation, is summarized in the church's creeds. And I want to talk in this lesson about the nature of creeds. You might well ask, well, why do we need creeds at all? I mean, if the content of faith is already given to us, the fullness of it is given in divine revelation, well, why bother with the creeds? Why can't we just stick to, say, sacred Scripture? And that's a great question. But we're going to find out just how helpful the creeds actually are and how necessary, really, in the end, they are to understanding the basic truths of divine revelation. Now, to begin with today, I want to call your attention to a great quote from St. Cyril of Jerusalem in paragraph 186. Now, this is kind of an extended quote, but I think it's very, very important to understand why we need creeds. St. Cyril of Jerusalem says this: "The synthesis of faith was not made to accord with human opinions, but rather what was of the greatest importance was gathered from all the Scriptures to present the one teaching of the faith in its entirety. And just as the mustard seed contains a great number of branches in a tiny grain, so too this summary of faith encompassed in a few words the whole knowledge of the true religion contained in the Old and New Testaments." And so faith here, what he's talking about, when he says synthesis, by the way, I should explain that. Synthesis means a kind of bringing together of elements. And so what you have, if you were to just depend upon, if someone were to ask you, if you had no reference to the creeds at all, well, what is the teaching of the Old and New Testaments? You might sort of wonder, well, how do I do that? How do I make sense of the Gospels in its relationship to 1st and 2nd Kings, in its relationship to the Psalms, in relationship to the book of Revelation? It can be very, very confusing. And so what you have in the creeds, are sort of roadmaps to the faith, so that you can understand, well, what is it that binds the totality of divine revelation all together? And so that's what St. Cyril is talking about here. He says, look, the creeds, and he's talking in particular about one creed, the baptismal creed. These creeds are there in order to sort of show us how all of divine revelation is a unity, an organic whole. Summarizes it in a kind of encapsulated form. Okay? So the creeds are helpful in that respect. They give us sort of our bearings in divine revelation. Okay, so let's get into the particulars of the creeds. Now, the first creed that Catholics profess is at their baptism. Now, for most of us, the first creed we professed, we didn't actually profess. Our parents did it on our behalf. They professed the creed for us so that we might grow up at the age of reason to profess it for ourselves. So that the faith is given to us. This is the great grace of God. The faith is given to us even before we have the intelligence or the reason to be able to accept the creed. So God's grace is already at work even prior to our ability to receive the content of the faith. That's a wonderful truth about the Catholic faith. Now, I was an adult convert to the Catholic faith, and so I did actually profess the creed for the very first time at not my baptism. I had been baptized before, but at my confirmation and reception into the church, which was a wonderful thing to be able to do. Now, of course, we said before that the creed that is recited at our baptism, the creed which is professed at baptism, or in my case at my confirmation, is the Apostles' Creed. And that creed is amongst the most ancient of the creeds, and in some ways then the simplest of the creeds. And it's divided really into three parts that correspond to the persons of the Trinity. Let's take a look at paragraph 190. We're told the creed is divided into three parts. The first part speaks of the first divine person, that's the Father, and the wonderful work of creation. The next speaks of the second divine person and the mystery of his redemption of men. The final part speaks of the third divine person, the origin and source of our sanctification. These are the three chapters of our baptismal seal. See, we are sealed with the Trinity, in the name of the Trinity. And so the Creed actually reflects, and you may have noticed this too in your own recitation of the Creed. If you pray the Rosary regularly, you would recite the Apostles' Creed, certainly at the beginning of the Rosary. But even in the Nicene Creed, which is more elaborate, you still follow a kind of Trinitarian structure. And I think that paragraph 190 kind of summarizes that beautifully. I want to call your attention to another. This is paragraph 191. The three parts are distinct, although connected with one another. According to a comparison often used by the Fathers, we call them articles. Indeed, just as in our bodily members there are certain articulations which distinguish and separate them, so too in this profession of faith, the name articles has justly and rightly been given to the truths we must believe particularly and distinctly. Okay, that's just part of paragraph 191. But when we talk, and I will talk quite a bit about this, of the articles of the faith, we don't mean article in the sense of like a magazine article. We mean it like as in an articulation. Okay, in the same way that we're told here in the Catechism that you have in a joint the articulation of two bones, where the two bones touch. And those articulations taken as a whole make up the human body. So the articles of faith taken as a whole express the totality of the Christian faith in summary form. All right, so the Church has formulated over the centuries a number of creeds. We've already said that the Apostles' Creed is amongst the earliest of the summaries of faith, but also the Nicene Creed, the so-called Athanasian Creed, and there are other creeds as well. It's important to understand, though, that while these creeds differ in some respects from one another, that they complement one another. Oftentimes they highlight certain aspects, central aspects of the faith over other elements. And so they have different emphases, but they all complement one another. And the later creeds, this is important to get as well, and the Catechism is very clear about this, that the later creeds don't sort of supersede or negate the earlier creeds. And so obviously the Nicene Creed doesn't render kind of superfluous and doesn't negate the Apostles' Creed. Rather, it complements it. It builds on it as well. So all the creeds are valid throughout the centuries, and we can't look at any of them and think, well, that they're now somehow obsolete. Now again, before we jump into an actual treatment of the articles of the faith found in the creed, let's distinguish the two most important for our study, the Apostles and the Nicene Creed. And I'm going to focus on two paragraphs in particular at this point. One is paragraph 194. The Apostles' Creed is so called because it is rightly considered to be a faithful summary of the Apostles' faith. It is the ancient baptismal symbol of the Church of Rome. Its great authority arises from this fact. It is the, quote, the creed of the Roman Church, the see of Peter, the first of the apostles, to which he brought the common faith, unquote. Okay, and then in paragraph 195, we have an explanation of the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed, or otherwise known as just the Nicene Creed, right here. It draws its great authority from the fact that it stems from the first two ecumenical councils in 325 and 381. It remains common to all the great churches of both the East and West to this day. And that last little point is very, very important, that these creeds are not just for the Catholic Church in the West, but for the Catholic Church throughout the world. Catholic meaning universal. These creeds are genuinely, or they are truly, universal creeds of the universal faith. And again, when we start, beginning in the next lesson, to speak about the articles of the faith, we will be using the Apostles' Creed, but we will be taking the insights and the contributions of both the Nicene Creed and the so-called Athanasian Creed as well to kind of flesh out our understanding of those articles of faith. So we'll see you in the next lesson.